I made a joke once in a YouTube short about how the Emperor's sense of humor revolves around irony, and a lot of people pointed out that he must find it hilarious that he is now the subject of the galaxy's biggest irony. You know, that being the ultimate turbo-atheist is now the head of his own religion.
The Messiah, will you please listen? I am not the Messiah, do you understand? Honestly!
Only the true Messiah denies his divinity.
What? Well, what sort of chance does that give me? All right, I am the Messiah! He is the Messiah! Now, fuck off!
Now, first and foremost, I want to apologize for this video being late. I was working on one before this, but I just couldn't get the script to work. It wasn't up to my standards, and I only want to give you guys really good content that both I am proud of and that you will enjoy. That being said, good lord, it feels good to work on a long, proper video again. Listen, the shorts are fun, but I'm mostly really only making those because it looks really good on a resume, because you can show that you make TikToks, and that's what news agencies look for. I'm studying journalism. And because I have much less time nowadays in order to work on videos, so I need something to tide the channel over. But my god, it seems to be working, because I have undergone by far the single biggest period of growth in my channel's history ever. And I want to thank you guys so much for getting this little channel to 20,000 subscribers. How bonkers is that? I have been doing shit on the internet for like over 10 years at this point. I had a Vine account, I've tried to get popular on Tumblr, Twitter, I've tried YouTube channels before like Minecraft playing, but it's never worked, and you guys made it happen. This is honestly insane. Thank you so much. Now, without further ado, let's get into the video. Now, when people think about the Imperial cult, they usually think about it as sort of background information. Oh, we all praise the God Emperor of Man. Oh, isn't that ironic that he actually hated religion? And in the context of Lorgar's fall to chaos after the burning of Monarchia. But the reality of the Imperial cult is actually far more interesting in my opinion, and I would love to get into it here, as well as discuss how truly important it is in regard to the survival of the Imperium and humanity as a whole, as well as some interesting similarities I've noticed with the lore of the Imperial cult and Christianity. And I know you're probably thinking, yeah, no shit, Captain Obvious, but just hear me out. I mean on a sort of deeper level, but I'll get into that later. First, let's start at the very beginning. When most people think of the birth of the Imperial cult, they tend to think of the Wordbearers Legion, and more specifically, their Primarch Lorgar Aurelian. But it does extend back further. You see, Lorgar himself had begun to believe the Emperor was a god before he even met him. He started having dreams and visions back on his planet of Colchis of a one true god, a one singular deity who would replace the polytheistic pantheon, which was actually chaos worship, that was in vogue on Colchis at the time. And despite his father's protests, he would eventually go on to pen the Lectitio Divinitatus, that being the original founding holy book of the Imperial cult. It's ironic though actually that Lorgar would be the first to turn traitor, when after his father rebuked him for worshipping him and converting planets to the worship of the Emperor, he would burn the city of Monarchia to the ground. A city that Lorgar touted as being the quote-unquote perfect city because of how well it embodied his ideas of piety to the Emperor and loyalty to the Imperium. This was the first instance we saw of the Imperial cult having any kind of institutional power, and can kind of be seen as an echo of what is to come, but it isn't the first instance of the Imperial cult. The Imperial cult didn't start with Lorgar, he was just the first and greatest advocate of it. The reality, however, can be found in the book Valdor, Birth of the Imperium, where we find out people were already starting to revere the Emperor as a god or as a godlike being even before the Unification Wars had wrapped up, even when Thunder Warriors were still the mainline force and the Space Marines weren't even a thing. So the Imperial cult literally predates the Adeptus Astartes. Now, one thing you have to consider is that it's not hard for people to actually convince others that they're God. Cult leaders do it fairly often with some pretty fucking disastrous results, either convincing others that they have a connection to God, God speaks to them directly, or even in some instances that they are the brother of Jesus Christ and instigating one of the bloodiest wars in all of human history. And those were just literally normal-ass people with a modicum of charisma. The Emperor, on the other hand, was a 14-foot-tall, golden-clad, glowing being with armies of post-human monsters who did not seemingly need to eat, sleep, or breathe. I'm not even gonna fucking explain myself. You guys get where I'm going with that. And it should also be noted that the reason the Emperor chose this aspect was so that he could present himself as a charismatic ruler that people are going to want to follow, but also as one powerful enough that people won't challenge. If you rule an entire galactic empire, but you're just some guy, especially a guy with no claim to divine right to rule like other emperors would have throughout history, you're going to be challenged. Other people will see you and think, yeah, I could do that. But when you look and present as the Emperor did, this golden, immaculate entity that is so mind-bogglingly beyond human, they're not gonna think, yeah, I could do that, I could be him. They will be willing to bend the knee very easily. It's said in the books that the Emperor presented himself in this immaculate golden warrior king way to his sons because that's what they would follow and that's what they would be receptive to. But that also applies to the bulk of humanity as well. If you're gonna present yourself as the guy about to lead the entire galaxy, you need to look the part. Now, the problem with this is, as we all know, how would people not think he's God? Just fucking look at the guy. Just take 2 seconds to even look at him if you can, because he apparently is physically painful to look at. And you'll see why people are gonna start worshipping him, and he should have known that. But he thought he could curtail it with suppression of faith, through edicts, and through just general denial of divinity. For some reason he thought he could curtail it, and in this he was catastrophically wrong, both about his ability to control people's thoughts, and the nature of humanity as a whole. And I'm not trying to say the, oh, you cannot separate faith from man sort of line that a lot of people like to tout, because I feel like that's just a little bit cheap to say, even if it is not without a basis in reality. But what I will say is that if somebody is going to make this undertaking, this single most monumental personal undertaking in the entirety of human history for tens of thousands of years, you're gonna need a lot of faith in that person inherently if you're going to follow them throughout all this and to see out a vision that you as a mortal human will never live to see the completion of. Furthermore, a galactic ruler like the Emperor is going to be making decisions on a timescale that the average person cannot comprehend and doing things that the average person won't really be able to process or make sense of, and as such, they're just going to have to take it on good faith. We can see this in the Unification Wars and the building of the early Imperium, where the Emperor built his palace on the flattened Himalayan mountains. Now we know the Himalayas like Mount Everest, the highest mountain range in the world. It seemed nonsensical to a lot of people. The air was thin, the soil wasn't good, all of those things. Now, of course, they didn't realize that that's where the Emperor's secret gene laboratories were, but they were left to wonder why he would do it, and Constantin Valdor comments on the fact that some people, a small minority at this time, are just taking it with a shrug and saying, oh well, he's doing it for his own reasons because he's divine, so we shouldn't question it. He knows what he's doing. And Valdor just shrugs these people off as ignorant, but you have to understand what these people were just coming out of. An age of pure ignorance and despotism where sorcerous warlords or techno-barbarian gangsters were in control of huge swaths of the planet. Basically nowhere was good to live, and this guy comes along, establishing order and the rule of law, and has the power to single-handedly flatten mountains. Well, not single-handedly, he had the technology and the know-how to do so, but still. Even now, flattening a mountain isn't something we really do. We can carve them out and dig tunnels through them, or even blow up parts of them, but we can't completely get rid of them, especially not the biggest ones in the world. But he did. And that will seem to a lot of people, especially uneducated ones, just getting out of the biggest dark age in human history, to be divine power. And if anything, that's probably one of the biggest blunders of Imperial leadership, that being the Emperor, Valdor, Malcador, and the High Lords, to basically think they could write that off by going, nuh-uh. Like, it was pretty obvious this was gonna happen. And if you were really that hell-bent on it not happening, there's probably better precautions you could have taken, in my opinion. Now, the Arbites and the Custodes would go about trying to suppress this, so nobody would really rise to any kind of institutional prominence following the Emperor's worship, but it still did pass from palm to palm, starting out from Terra when the Great Crusade began, or appear on its own organically as things progressed in different places, as the Emperor descended from the sky to wash away aliens and tyrants alike in a wave of technology and power with his genetically engineered super soldiers. But, barring Lorgar's little fiefdom where he would establish faith as the dominant rule, why would a small underground illegal religion eventually become the single dominant faith throughout all of human society? Well, if you want to know why, you have to look at when that actually happened in real life, that being with the rise of Christianity. You see, the Christians themselves were oppressed initially. They were a quote-unquote mystery religion or mystery cult, and a lot of their first followers did meet in quiet, closed-off rooms and were either at best ignored by authorities or at worst actively purged by violent mobs in what were effectively pogroms. This is where we can first see the stirrings of similarities between Christianity and the Imperial cult, that being in both their underground roots and who their initial followers were, both the poor and the wealthy, but for different reasons. The poor would gravitate to both Christianity and the Imperial cult because it offered hope and a sense of salvation and a sense of community in a world where there seemed like there was very little of that to go around. However, the wealthy would gravitate to Christianity and the Imperial cult because it was secretive. It was this cool underground thing, and they would meet in these back rooms and discuss the texts and just meet up and had the thrill of engaging in something secret that they weren't supposed to be in. We do see that in the Solar War. There were rich rogue traders and nobles who would meet in private to discuss the Imperial cult and the Lectitio Divinitatus just because it was this cool underground thing. And those people, and especially their children, would go on to become avowed believers later on down the line. That, however, only goes so far when it comes to growing a real actual faith. For that, what you realistically need is, well, a lot of things, but in this context you need like 3 things: standardized teaching, symbols, and an upheaval. Now, the standardized teachings in this case come from the Lectitio Divinitatus written by Lorgar that I've mentioned a few times. And one thing I want to get out of the way is, you would expect people to stop reading the Lectitio Divinitatus and just cast it out as soon as Lorgar was publicly known as a traitor to the Imperium, his father's Imperium that he worshipped. But you have to remember, he didn't publish it under his own name. He published it under the title The Urizen, so the vast majority of people didn't know that he wrote it. They did, however, know of the rumors that, quote, one of the Emperor's sons did believe in the cult of the Emperor, and that actually gave them a fair bit of legitimacy. They just didn't know it happened to be one of the traitors, ironically. A big part of the reason religions like Christianity and Islam were able to spread so effectively is the fact that they had singular unified books that were pretty easy to comprehend and could be passed around from person to person without needing large-scale temples or statues or other things like that. Those would come later on. However, the older religions like Hinduism, which I'm a part of, and Zoroastrianism and even Judaism either didn't have singular unified texts or had texts that weren't easily accessible or digestible to the average person, meaning these religions spread very slowly and very deliberately. Christianity and Islam did in centuries what it took us thousands of years to accomplish even a fraction of. And you cannot understate the ability of easily digestible literature to facilitate this kind of spread. So, again, there would be no Imperial cult had Lorgar not penned the Lectitio Divinitatus. Religions, however, are nothing without a very human element to them, and that's where figures come in. Now, in an underground religion like this, they're obviously not going to be people like a pope or something like that, or in this case, a member of the Ministorum, because those institutions didn't exist, so you can't have figureheads in them. I'm referring to people in these underground spheres who inspire hope and adoration to both people in the faith already and outsiders, inspiring them to come in. In Christianity, you had usually martyrs, people who died in the Colosseum to lions in Rome for their faith, or people like Saint Romanus, who publicly called out Roman pagan traditions and said, hey, this is wrong, it's sinful, and for that had his tongue publicly cut out and was beaten to death. Now, there weren't really as many martyrs when it comes to the Imperial cult, but what they did have was Euphrati Keeler, the, quote, first saint of the Imperial cult, and the first person to ever really perform a miracle, when she held up the Aquila and basically banished a demon back to the warp with a blast of energy. This spread, and her name became known, people began to really see her as the first figurehead of this religion, and people looked to her in their darkest hours that were to come. Again, I know I say this a lot, but you can't understate the need of religions, especially in their early years, to have a figurehead people can look to for guidance and to lead them out of dark places during times of greatest trial. I also just now mentioned the fact that she used an Imperial Aquila necklace to banish this demon thing that attacked her. This happens very early on in the heresy, but that too is another symbol, and a very important one. Having that Aquila symbol become the image of the faith, a covert one that you could wear, revere, and use to identify fellow believers in a way that is subtle enough where you won't really be noticed all that much. You could consider it in that way analogous to the Christian crucifix, or even more so, that fish symbol that early Christians used to use in order to hide from imperial authorities in Rome. And now finally we come to the biggest thing that really caused the birth of the imperial cult as we know it. What really let it finally spread and become the domineering galactic force it is today, and again something it shares in common with Christianity, that being catastrophe. You see, in Christianity, they were persecuted in Rome, yes, on both a local and institutional level. However, this would all begin to change with the 3rd century crisis. You see, the 3rd century crisis was a period in Roman history when an effective revolving door of emperors came and went. They would die, they were assassinated, they were betrayed. Over and over and over again, the legions were in constant revolt, and barbarian invasions were rampant. Because of these things, there were food shortages, massive price hikes of everything. Bread was not available, nobody was safe, the empire was falling apart, it was a living hell. Like, it is one of the worst periods to have ever been alive in the civilized world. But this would prove to be a boon for Christianity, because as imperial authority effectively went into freefall and became non-functional throughout large swaths of the empire, the church stepped in to fill the void. People would go to them and find shelter, or food, or just a place to sleep, or even a sense of community when everything around them was literally going to hell. And it was at this time that a lot of those people who were helped by the church would go on to become members of it, especially the poor, the downtrodden, and other people who were suffering more than ever in the Roman Empire. This right here is where we see the transition from Christianity to being an early mystery cult, as they were known, to a proper institution, and would see Christians grow to make up around 10% of the empire. They weren't this fringe minority anymore that you could just really kick around. You could not factor them in anymore when thinking about Roman politics. And all because the ability of the Roman state to oppress Christians and to provide for people had really broken down during this period of civil unrest. Oh, hello Horus Heresy, how are you over there? Yeah, that's the actual equivalent to the Roman 3rd century crisis, the Horus Heresy, and especially the Siege of Terra. Because when the entire galaxy was burning, again, imperial authority started to go kaput, and they couldn't provide for people or protect them. So, the Conclave, as it was called, stepped in. And this we see more than ever during the later stages of the Siege of Terra, when a lot of people were completely abandoned. Anyone who wasn't drafted was basically left to fend for themselves in the front of the traitor onslaught, and even got locked out of a lot of spaceport cities or even the Imperial Palace itself. So, the Conclave would seek to organize refugees, start rationing out supplies, and set up militia forces with whatever they had. It wasn't that much, but to the people being helped during this time of greatest trial, it was everything. And during the siege, a lot of these efforts would be coordinated by the aforementioned Euphrati Keeler and people like Kirill Sinderman. But it wasn't just providing for people that started to win the masses over to the imperial cult during this time. It was also the fact that it gave people hope and something to fight for. When these people, who were literally facing down the legions of hell itself, were going to put themselves in harm's way, they needed something to hold on to at that time. This is remarked on by various soldiers who we see coming around to the imperial cult over the course of the war. They need something to believe in, something to bolster their confidence in the face of, according to Jagatai Khan, no business existing in the same universe as. This is commented on really well in the book Saturnine, wherein a guardsman by the name of Olanius, no relation, Piers, explains that even though he doesn't necessarily believe in the imperial cult, he wants a copy of the Lectitio Divinitatis so that he can spread it around and show it to people. And he starts holding up banners of the Emperor, saying, if we hold this banner, it will protect us. Throne of Terra, Throne of Terra, and things like that. He does this not because he believes, but because, quote, soldiers lie. Soldiers lie in order to be able to process the horror of the things they live through better. And he believes that hanging on to this faith, even if it's not necessarily true in his mind, is good for the morale of the soldiers and will help them face down the unspeakable things they are facing down. We see that happen exactly. And a character I personally love and have mentioned on this channel several times, Katsuhiro, becomes, over the course of the Siege of Terra, from the very beginning all the way to the end, a believer in the Imperial faith, and eventually joins the Imperial Conclave, once again led by Euphrati Keeler. And there's also a funny moment in the early siege where it seems like a High Lord of Terra is secretly a believer, because when they're talking about how things are going in the battle, he stops and says, "The Emperor protects." Then everybody basically just looks at him, including Rogel Dorn, and he has a moment of like, or so they say, you know, that's what people are saying, I don't really know. I just thought that was really funny. This was also instrumental in the early spread of Christianity because you have to understand, the faith of the Romans was not an apocalyptic faith. It didn't really provide answers on how to deal with the end of the world. And to a lot of people living at the time, that's what this seemed like. It literally seemed to a lot of people to be the end of days that the Christians preached of. People thought Christians were crazy because they were saying, Jesus will return, the rapture will happen, we will all face final judgment in the flames. And people are like, yeah, okay, whatever, buddy. But then the 3rd century crisis rolled around and people had a moment of, oh shit, it looks like exactly that is happening right now. So I do firmly believe that without the Horus Heresy and the Siege of Terra, the Imperial cult never would have taken off. And not just because the Emperor was indisposed, it wouldn't have had the catalyst to really begin winning people over through good deeds and through fear of what was effectively the apocalypse. And speaking of the Emperor himself, I would also like to say that I think his absence, both from the earlier Great Crusade and especially during the Siege of Terra, helped to foster this sense of faith. It's easier to believe something is divine or someone is a god when you hear all these amazing things about them and have a vague idea of their power and abilities and know what's being written about them and said about them than when you actually see them in person. That person is a king and a leader, but a god you have faith in and don't see. Since the Emperor was not there leading from the front, both in the later stages of the Crusade and during the siege, people had to have faith in him in order to fight for him. Or else, how do you really justify it? How do you really bring yourself to bear against these things? So, I think the Emperor's absence is sort of what helped deify him in the minds of a lot of people. So, after the Horus Heresy was concluded, and humanity was left to pick up the pieces without the Emperor, Malcador, or Constantine Valdor, or even the Primarchs for that matter, what happened? Well, many different cults now existed, all worshipping the Emperor, but the one that would gain institutional power and come to rule Terra, quote-unquote, is called the Temple of the Savior Emperor. They were based on Terra itself and had the best ability to spread, and would eventually have their own armed guard called the Frateris Templar, and this institution would literally go to rival the Imperial Guard in its scale and how well armed it was. It was this Temple of the Savior Emperor that would go on to become the Adeptus Ministorum, and they would actually basically rule the Imperium for a while, constantly vying against the Administratum for authority and coming out on top because of their religious significance. However, this wasn't to last, because over time, their leaders would grow more and more decadent, extracting more and more tithes, building temples, and arming their guards more and more. You know how it is, that sort of decadent decay that you get with institutional power. And we actually saw this in real life, wherein, after those really early schisms between various Christian groups like Arian Christianity versus Trinitarian Christianity, which are basically two separate things and can be seen as those early cults of the Emperor before the Ministorum, were all smoothed out, and we saw the rise of the proper Catholic Church, they would eventually go on to become rather decadent in how they dealt with things, extracting more and more money, with popes ruling more like de facto kings of Europe and the Papal States in particular. And we would also see in real life the jockeying for power between the Holy Roman Emperors, you know, the HRE, yeah, not holy, not Roman, not an empire, we've all heard the meme, and the papacy throughout that period of time. And this era of decadence would also see the Imperial cult move back and forth in its headquarters from Terra to Ophelia 4, a different planet nearby, a few times, which was actually a big strain on the treasury. We actually did see this in real life around this medieval era, wherein the papacy would be moved from Rome to Avignon in France. And all of this heavy politicization of the Imperial cult would eventually see the rise of Goj van Dyer, the single most infamous character in this entire period of history. And it would be under him that the Age of Apostasy would truly begin. It had started before him, but it's most notably attached to his name. This guy was a complete psychopath from the very beginning. If you've ever seen Sam O'Nella's video about wacky, weird popes, yeah, he's like all of those guys times 10. He was nuts and awful. So, as you can imagine, frustration with the Imperial cult grew and grew and grew, until there was eventually a split. This came about when a then unknown priest named Sebastian Thor on a small planet called Dimamar would declare Goj van Dyer a heretic and lead what was known as the Confederation of Light. His Confederation of Light would go about bringing more and more planets into the fold and effectively lead a large-scale war against Goj van Dyer, who was abandoned by more and more people. Now see, what all this reminds me of is the Protestant Reformation, wherein the older decadent ways of the Catholic Church, and more specifically the papacy, would be challenged by a new way of thinking that was far more austere and, more importantly, had a very different political leaning, which made it attractive to people who had become enemies of the papacy in this time or chafed under their rule. And it should also be known that the ideologies of the Confederation of Light revolved a lot around things like penitence, sacrifice, and humility, which made it seem a lot more like Protestantism, especially back during that time, like old Calvinism or Puritan beliefs. And the conflicts that would arise between the Confederacy of Light and Goj van Dyer's old Temple of the Savior Emperor, to me, smack of the 30 Years' War. That was the period in time in which all of Europe damn near tore itself apart in catastrophic conflict over religious disputes. But it wasn't just about religious disputes, it was a far more political conflict, and it was a lot more complicated than just this. You see, in real life, the line between Protestant and Catholic was much more blurred, and the papacy had its merits. Both sides had their merits, really, while here, the papacy, or Temple of the Savior Emperor, was flatly evil, especially because it was led by an insane psychopath, while the Confederacy of Light was unilaterally good, even though the Protestants were not unilaterally good during the 30 Years' War. It's a massive simplification, but I think you can definitely see how I conflate the two in a historical sense, and I think that's really interesting. How this would all end is with the assassination of Goj van Dyer by the head of the Adepta Sororitas, his all-female guard. Now, I have completely glossed over the origins of the Adepta Sororita, and that's because I'm saving that for a video specifically about the Age of Apostasy, as opposed to the formation of the Imperial cult. And I really think they do deserve their own video because they're just really interesting and I want to do them justice. But for now, we'll basically put a pin in it and leave it there. The leader of the Sisters of Battle would go on to kill Goj van Dyer, thus ending the Age of Apostasy, when Sebastian Thor would become the new head of the ecclesiarchy and reform it to be a much better institution. Though it should be noted, the old beliefs of the Temple of the Savior Emperor do still exist underground, where it's called the Temple Tendency. Some people are known to have a, quote, tendency towards the temple, which means they exhibit a lot of the old characteristics of the faith, and they sort of work in secret to try and rebuild the spiritual, political, and militaristic power of the Temple of the Savior Emperor. Will they be successful? I really don't think so, if I'm being honest. But they did launch a rebellion after the Great Rift opened, saying, oh, look, this is proof that the Confederation of Light is not valid, and the Emperor is angry with us, and so forth. But it did not really go anywhere. And I would also like to note that the Imperial cult is a very, very flexible and localized belief system. While yes, there is a strong orthodoxy radiating out of Terra, smaller systems, especially ones on the fringe, do have their own interpretations of certain things, even if they are effectively at the core the same and have a lot of the same core beliefs, because the Ministorum does make sure to reach out to basically every planet and instill a level of orthodoxy amongst its followers. But it is known that one very common local variant of the Imperial cult is to view the Emperor as a sort of sun deity, him being worshipped along with a lot of solar aspects and with a lot of light motifs, as you would expect. The core tenets of the Imperial cult are as follows. 1. The Emperor once walked among men, but he is and always has been a god. 2. The Emperor is the one true god, regardless of what past faiths any human may have worshipped. 3. To purge the heretic, beware the psyker and mutant, and abhor the alien. 4. Every human being has a place within the Emperor's divine order. And 5. To unquestionably obey the authority of the Imperial government and one's superiors. Yeah, funny that last one. So yeah, basically the last one is effectively a grab at divine right to rule, but the one I find the most interesting is the one where you must purge the heretic, fear the psyker and mutant, and abhor the alien. These were all beliefs held by the Emperor himself, and were the core tenets of the Imperial truth in the Great Crusade. You can see a lot of overlap between the Imperial truth and what would become the Imperial cult. But while the Imperial truth had rational reasons for all of its ways of thinking, even the alien and the psyker and the mutant thing, there is no real rhyme or reason behind the ones in the Imperial cult aside from the Emperor said so. Basically, what was once logic-driven and of necessity for the sake of humanity has become codified into religious law and is still followed to this day, even though people don't really understand why on a deeper level. And one thing that should also be known is that there are some concepts in Christianity that do exist in the Imperial cult that weren't previously touched on, such as the idea of the demonic, or enemies of that which is divine. In this case, it's called the Great Enemy, or the powers of the warp in general. While people don't really understand the nature of chaos or the dark gods, or what's truly in the warp, they have a vague underlying idea that there is something bad there and they need to pray it away. And funnily enough, Horus Lupercal is basically seen as a sort of Satan-like figure in the Imperial cult. He is known as having led the, quote, 9 devils from the outer dark against the Emperor, and the Emperor then had to create the 9 Primarchs to oppose them, Sanguinius being the greatest of them all, and being the centerpiece of one of the Imperium's largest holidays, Sanguinalia. With this bastardized version of events, alongside the sort of morphing of the Imperial truth, you could see how these beliefs would come about after 10,000 years of time and drift. But I think it is still pretty funny, like in books where you hear people talk about what they think the Horus heresy was, and knowing the truth, it's really interesting in my mind. Or hearing people talk about the warp and the dark powers with just this weird superstition when you again know how bad it really is just really interesting to me. And ultimately, I believe this is why the Imperial cult does begrudgingly more good than harm, because it allows people, especially the weak and downtrodden, to cling on to something that isn't inherently harmful. Oftentimes, the most disabused of society would start going towards chaos worship, because that's how the ruinous powers would get in. But now that people blindly fear a quote-unquote great enemy and thrust themselves into praising the Emperor so much, even though it's not what he wants, there's not really time or room for chaos to get in. This blind faith in the Imperial cult is basically holding the galaxy together with spit and sellotape, because it basically snuffs out chaos. It is so dogmatic, it ends up smothering what is actually dangerous. That's why, in my mind, if the Emperor had not become a deified figure as he tried so hard not to be, humanity would not have survived and would probably be in the thrall of the ruinous powers by now. And therein is the greatest irony of all. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think I'm right when I say the Imperial cult is what's stopping the spread of chaos? Do you think I'm right in my comparisons to the Protestant Reformation, or the 30 Years' War, or early Christianity in Rome? And do you guys have any other interpretations that maybe you want to share in the comments below? I would love to hear what you guys think, and until then, I will see you in the next video.